I never thought my life would turn into something out of a twisted drama. But the night I uncovered my wife's deepest betrayal, I realized, some marriages don't end with a goodbye. They end with the truth, and the truth changes everything. The call that changed everything. Hey Mike, it's Chris Harrington, Jenny Palmer's brother-in-law. Is Colleen available? I didn't even hear the click when Mike hung up. The sound was drowned out by my wife, Mary, pounding on my locked home office door, her voice raised in frustration. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone, debating my next move. 2 minutes later, I redialed the number. The moment he answered, his tone was sharp and full of warning. Listen, punk, if you call this number again, I'll report you to the cops. Do you understand? I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice steady. I do, Mike. I understand completely. But you need to understand 2 things. 1, I don't care if you call the cops. And 2, more importantly, I will be speaking to your wife. And there's not much you can do to stop me. Have a good night. This time, I was the one who got the satisfaction of hanging up. Mary was still shouting, still hammering against the door, but I barely registered it. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and tried to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. My mind was spinning. What should I do next? Should I call my sister-in-law's husband? I wasn't sure. The beginning of us. I first met Mary back in high school. I was a junior, sitting in the bleachers with my buddies, waiting for the Friday night football game to start. A group of sophomore girls had taken the seats in front of us, and as the game got underway, we all took turns making trips to the concession stand. When it was my turn, a cute blonde named Mary got up to go with me. We walked together, balancing trays of hot dogs, fries, and sodas, and ended up sitting side by side when we got back. She was sharp, funny, and best of all, single. Midway through the third quarter, someone in our group shouted, "Are we hitting McDonald's after the game?" Everyone cheered in agreement, already making plans to extend the night. Taking a chance, I turned to Mary and said, "I don't know about you, but I'd rather have a pizza than greasy fries. Want to go to Tony's instead?" To my surprise, and absolute delight, she smiled and said yes. From that night on, we started going out once a week. Just casual at first, but after a couple of months, we decided to make it official. Mary was my date to the junior prom, and that night, walking into the dance with the most beautiful girl in school on my arm, I felt like I was on top of the world. Until I wasn't. The first sign of trouble. 2 weeks later, just days before the senior prom, things took an unexpected turn. I was jogging to the tennis courts for practice, running alongside my neighbor, Julie Burke. She played on the girls' team and we'd known each other our entire lives. That's why I was caught off guard when she turned to me, a hesitant look on her face, and said, "You know, I think you're a really great guy, Chris." Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. The first betrayal. I frowned, glancing at Julie as we jogged. "Why are you telling me this now?" She laughed and gave my shoulder a playful punch. "Because it's sweet of you to let Mary go to the senior prom with Jimmy. Otherwise he'd never have the chance. You know how shy and nerdy he is. Jimmy Ba was a good guy, kind, quiet, and, if I had to guess, probably on the spectrum. He lived in Mary's neighborhood and she'd always looked out for him. So, I wasn't entirely shocked that she had agreed to be his date. But what did surprise me? The fact that she hadn't told me. By Friday afternoon, at least 6 different people had complimented me on my maturity, saying how great it was that I was letting my steady girlfriend go to prom with a friend. The truth? I didn't feel mature. I felt furious. Mary didn't even have the guts to tell me herself. I had to hear about it from everyone but her. I knew she'd have to come clean eventually. Our usual Friday night date would force her to bring it up. But by then I'd already made up my mind. At the last minute that afternoon, I sent her a text. "Plans changed. Can't make it tonight." Almost instantly, my phone lit up with a barrage of messages and voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. After a dozen dings, I finally replied. "I've known about your prom date since Monday. At least 10 people told me. Too bad you weren't one of them. I want a girlfriend I can trust, and that's not you." Then I turned off my phone and sulked. Getting back together. Mary and I stayed apart for the rest of that school year. It wasn't until the start of the next fall that we crossed paths again. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was heading to my car in the student parking lot when I spotted her, sitting casually on the hood of my car, like nothing had ever happened. As I walked up, she tilted her head and smiled. "Will you let an old girlfriend buy you an ice cream at Dairy Queen?" And just like that, we started over. For the next 2 years, we were inseparable. Even when I left for college in New York City, we made the long-distance thing work. I came home as often as I could, and in March of her senior year, shortly after her 18th birthday, we exchanged virginities. It felt like a milestone, like we had sealed something permanent between us. The end of us, or so I thought. We stayed together until the following year when she left for college. 2 weeks into her freshman year, I got an email, one I hadn't been expecting. A Dear John letter. Apparently, college life was too exciting for Mary to be tied down to a full-time boyfriend. She wanted to be free to explore, to have fun. I never replied. I never called. And honestly, I didn't need to. I was doing just fine. I had great grades, I was a solid Division III tennis player, and I was popular. By the very next night, Mary had been replaced by a steady rotation of new girls. A chance encounter. I didn't see Mary again until 2 years after she graduated from college. By then, I had settled into my career as a staff engineer for a local defense contractor. One Friday night, after a grueling workweek, I was out with some colleagues at a bar, unwinding over drinks. That's when I quite literally bumped into her. We exchanged a few pleasantries, nothing too deep, before returning to our respective groups. But I'll admit, for the next hour, I found myself keeping an eye on her. I debated whether I should follow her outside when I noticed her group starting to leave. But instead of heading for the exit, she did something unexpected. She turned back, walked to the bar, and took a seat. When her drink arrived, she swiveled her stool until she was facing me directly, locking eyes with our table. I smirked, watching as a steady stream of men approached her, each one shot down just as quickly as they arrived. It wasn't until the business trip. The next morning, I had an early 7:30 a.m. meeting with a longtime customer and friend, Tony. We were set to meet at the downtown Marriott in New Haven, Connecticut, home to a ridiculously overrated university that starts with Y. By the time I arrived, Tony was already seated in the conference room I had reserved. As I set up my laptop, organized my paperwork, and poured myself a steaming cup of black coffee, we caught up on work and a bit of small talk. Tony was a civilian contractor, assigned by his company to work on a classified project for the U.S. Navy. After our meeting wrapped up, I stopped by the hotel gift shop to grab a Diet Coke before heading back to the conference room. The moment I stepped inside, a strange feeling washed over me, like the walls were closing in. Deciding a change of scenery might help, I packed my things and relocated to a quiet corner of the hotel lobby. I checked in with my office and discovered that a minor issue had cropped up earlier that morning. After firing off a few texts, including one to Mary, letting her know she should have dinner without me, I settled into a comfortable chair. That's when something caught my attention. A man nearby had been watching me closely. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but direct. "I saw you taking pictures of the couple who just checked in. Do you know them?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "I know the woman." He studied me, then asked, "Can I assume you were surprised to see her with her gentleman friend?" I let out a slow breath. "Very surprised." He nodded. "Mr. Harrington, may I be blunt?" I met his gaze and gave a short nod. "I'm concerned that there's going to be trouble if you stay here." I raised an eyebrow. "I've never been the type to start trouble, if that's what you're implying." The man didn't look convinced. Across the room, Mike and Jenny exchanged uneasy glances as I turned to them, breaking the tension with a single question. "So tell me, do you think Jenny is more attractive dressed like this? Or would you prefer the sexy, hip-hugging jeans, skin-tight blouse, and boots?" Exposing the truth. I waved a hand, gesturing toward Jenny. "So, which look do you prefer, Mike? The classy black dress she had on 3 hours ago when you slipped off to the 8th floor to inspect meeting rooms? Or the outfit she's wearing now?" Before either of them could react, I shifted my gaze to Mike's left hand. A shiny wedding band gleamed under the dim hotel lights. "Nice ring, Mike," I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. "I see you're just as much of a lying, cheating pile of garbage as Jenny." Jenny flinched but remained silent, her eyes locking onto mine, searching for something, maybe an escape, maybe an excuse. I let the silence linger before pressing forward. "Jenny, how long have you known me?" She still didn't answer. I nodded, filling in the gap myself. "At least a dozen years, right? Since I first started dating Mary in high school?" Her expression didn't change. "Then tell me," I continued, my voice dropping to a furious whisper, "what in all that time would make you think I wouldn't tell my best friend that his wife is a lying, cheating woman?" I turned toward the exit, but not before catching the eye of James, the hotel manager. He gave me a slight nod, one of gratitude, maybe, or understanding. I pushed through the door and stepped out into the crisp night air, my heart pounding. Jenny had once told me it was only once. Well, that was a lie. And now Mary knew it too. Confronting Mary. I stood in our kitchen, watching as Mary took a long sip of wine, her expression unreadable. Jenny told me she only cheats when Scott is on the road, I said, my voice steady. And I couldn't help but notice you didn't answer my question. So let me ask again. Did you know your sister cheats on Scott? Mary let out a slow sigh before finally speaking. Chris, this is between Scott and Jenny. I let out a dry chuckle, shaking my head. That's the first thing you've said that I actually agree with. It is between them. My problem is that Scott doesn't know there's a problem. That bothers me. Mary's eyes narrowed and suddenly she exploded. How dare you accuse me of cheating? I immediately fired back, my voice sharp. I've never accused you of cheating, Mary. But your cavalier attitude toward your sister screwing around has me wondering if you have. Her lips parted as if to argue, but I wasn't finished. You and I both know you can't prove you haven't cheated. All I have is my trust in you. And right now? I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. That trust is severely shaken. I turned and walked out, heading toward the guest bedroom. But I didn't go in. Instead, I sank into a chair at the kitchen table and reached for my glass of bourbon. The burn of Knob Creek slid down my throat, momentarily numbing the storm raging in my head. Across from me, Mary sat motionless, her mind working overtime, no doubt preparing her next attack. I didn't have much fight left in me. And I knew that one last sip of bourbon wouldn't change that. Then, just as I was bracing for Mary's response, my phone buzzed. The weight of the truth. I believe they're in a monogamous marriage. I believe they have a happy family, I said, my voice even. Mary's eyes widened, her hands flying to her face in shock. I exhaled, leaning back slightly. Apparently, this is the third time she's caught him cheating. She's going to divorce him. Mary looked stunned, speechless as she stared at me. I swirled the last sip of bourbon in my glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light before tossing it back in one gulp. The warmth burned down my throat, but it did nothing to dull the mess unraveling around me. After rinsing my glass in the sink, I turned and headed upstairs to our bedroom. Lying in bed, I tried to make sense of everything, what had just happened, what it meant for my extended family, and what it meant for me. Walking past my open bottle of bourbon on the way up had been difficult. My first instinct had been to keep a clear head. My second thought? Screw it. I turned back, poured myself another drink, just an inch and a half, enough to take the edge off but not enough to cloud my judgment. The family gathering. When I re-entered the kitchen, all eyes were on me. Everyone was seated around the table, an empty chair waiting between Mary and her father, Steve. I didn't sit. Instead, I leaned against the counter, swirling the glass in my hand. This wasn't your business, Chris, Mary finally said. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, a careful choice of words as if she was saying it more for her family's benefit than for mine. I raised an eyebrow. I told you, it was my business. Before Mary could reply, my mother-in-law chimed in. That's debatable. I didn't get a chance to respond. Jenny's voice cut through the tension. Are you meeting Scott tomorrow? She asked. I am, I replied. Her voice wavered. What are you going to tell him? I shrugged. Not much more than what I've already told him. I sent him the pictures I took. Told him you were with Mike for just under 3 hours. Sent him Mike's name and address. Jenny paled. Mary shifted beside her, staring down at the table as if it held the answers to all of this. Mary's admission. Then Mary finally spoke. It's not fair, Chris. I scoffed. Not fair. Before she could continue, I cut her off. I asked you 3 times last night if you knew Jenny was cheating on Scott. 3 times, Mary. And each time you avoided the question. You didn't lie, but you were dishonest. Mary let out a breath, her shoulders sagging. Yes, she admitted quietly. I've known about Jenny's affairs. I haven't supported her, but I didn't want to cause a mess like this. She waved her hands toward the room, toward the wreckage of everything unraveling around us. I took another sip of bourbon, letting the silence stretch. Mary might not have caused this mess, but she had let it happen. Mary's excuses and Mike's arrogance. I hoped her affairs would fizzle out on their own, Mary admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I let out a dry chuckle. Well, that worked out great, didn't it? Before she could respond, a sneering voice cut through the air. I'll bet you forgot about me. It took a second, maybe 2, before I recognized him. Hi, Mike. My tone was flat, unamused. I heard Colleen dumped you. How does it feel to be an absentee dad? His smirk faltered for half a second before he recovered. Screw you. It's your fault. I glanced at my friends, Carl and Joe, who looked more entertained than concerned. Then, turning back to Mike, I folded my arms. Yeah, your divorce is my fault? Mike let out a bitter laugh, then shrugged. All right, fine. I guess it was partly my fault too. But come on, there's so many married women out there. It's not like you've got to be the stupidest scumbag on the face of the earth, I cut in, clenching my jaw. His grin only widened, but it faltered when I added, when I hand Scott those pictures, he's going to file for divorce. And since you just happen to be Jenny's direct supervisor, how long do you think it'll take before he sues you and your company? Mike's smirk disappeared completely. You'll be out of a job in a week, I continued, shaking my head. It took everything in me not to enjoy the way his confidence drained from his face. But instead of feeding into it, I just started laughing. The idiot had underestimated me. Making plans. I pushed aside the whirlwind of emotions, anger, frustration, sadness, and focused on what needed to be done. Grabbing my phone, I called Scott. Can you meet me for dinner tonight? After hanging up, I spent 15 minutes staring blankly at my desk before inviting a second person to join us. Tears burned at the edges of my eyes as I continued outlining my next moves. I knew one thing for sure, I wouldn't be able to act normal around Mary. I had to get away. Work gave me the perfect excuse. I traveled almost once a month, half of the trips planned in advance, the other half last-minute emergencies. This time? It wasn't urgent. But it was necessary. The reckoning. My thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of screaming. My mind snapped back to the present. She was crying, struggling against them, her hands desperately trying to pull her shorts back up as they yanked at her. And that's when I saw red. Stan Malloy barely had time to turn before the rim of my tennis racket slammed into his nose with a sickening crunch. Blood exploded in every direction as he let out a blood-curdling scream, collapsing onto the ground. Before Joey Burns could react, my backhand connected solidly with his cheek. And just like that, he was down for the count. The aftermath. Everything after that was a blur. The three remaining thugs tackled me to the ground, fists and boots raining down as I tried to shield myself. Pain exploded through my ribs, my head, my back. Everywhere. I heard shouting, distant and muffled, but I couldn't make out the words. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Through the haze, I saw him standing there, his icy stare fixed on the guys who had just beaten me senseless. Even in my state, barely able to move, I knew that look would have sent a chill down my spine under normal circumstances. I want their names, he said. I coughed, wincing as I tried to speak. Stan Malloy and Joey Burns will be at the hospital when you get there. I busted their faces with my racket. I rattled off the other three names just as an ambulance and a police car pulled up behind my own vehicle. One of the officers, Mr. Mell, leaned in until our noses were nearly touching. I could smell the garlic on his breath. His voice was low, just above a whisper. If you ever. The escape plan. I booked a hotel room and decided to work remotely, emailing my team to let them know I'd be traveling into the following week. Collapsing into the stiff recliner in the corner of the room, I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of everything that had unraveled over the last few weeks. It was painfully clear to me now. Because I had taken such a hard stance against Jenny's affairs, Mary couldn't tell me about her own infidelity with Mike and his friends. She knew, without a doubt, that if I found out, I'd divorce her. And she was right. As I mulled over my next steps, my mind drifted to the practical side of things, the divorce equation. By the weekend, I had purchased everything I needed to set my plan in motion. After checking off the last item on my list, I took a long hike in the mountains on Sunday, clearing my head. When I returned to the hotel, I turned on my phone. It immediately flooded with missed calls and texts. Mary, her family, a few work associates. Apparently, Mary was extremely upset that I had gone off the grid. She was trying to track me down. I ignored every message. Monday and Tuesday were spent tying up loose ends from my hotel room, making sure everything was in order for my absence. And then I went home. A chilling welcome. When Mary found me, I was sitting on the couch watching the fire. A plate of cheese and crackers sat on the table, next to a bottle of wine. I held one glass in my hand. A second glass rested at the other end of the table, for her. She stood in the doorway, eyes darting between me and the scene in front of her. "What the hell are you doing?" she demanded. "The heat is overbearing in here." I finally turned away from the fire, meeting her gaze. My expression was unreadable. "What does it look like I'm doing?" I said calmly. I raised my glass slightly before taking a slow sip. "I've prepared a romantic welcome for my wife." The breaking point. I noticed the beads of sweat forming on Mary's forehead, despite the fact that she hadn't moved much. The room was warm, sure, but this wasn't just the heat. This was panic. Her face contorted, anger, disbelief, something else I couldn't quite place. And then, without warning, she lunged. Her hand smashed into my left eye, sending a sharp jolt of pain through my skull. Her fingernails raked across my cheek, breaking the skin. The contents of both wine glasses splashed onto my shirt, staining it deep red, dripping onto the floor. And then, just as quickly as her rage had exploded, her expression changed again. Her breath hitched. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time I saw it, utter confusion. She turned without a word, bolting up the stairs. Moments later, the bedroom door slammed shut. I sat there for a moment, motionless. Despite the sting in my face and the weight in my chest, I found myself smiling. Because my plan had worked to perfection. The arrival of the police. A knock at the door pulled me back to reality. When I opened it, I was met by 3 uniformed officers. The one in front, an older, more seasoned-looking cop, eyed me carefully. "We got a call about a domestic disturbance," he said. "We need to talk to your wife. Are we going to find any damage inside?" I met his gaze evenly. "I've never touched my wife, or any other woman," in anger. The younger officer to his right spoke next. "What about firearms?" "I own several handguns," I admitted. "They're all in a gun safe in my office. My wife doesn't have the combination." The 2 younger officers stepped inside to speak with Mary. The older one lingered, studying me. I let out a breath and nodded toward the TV. "Would you like to see a video of my wife hitting me?" He squinted slightly as if trying to process what I had just said. And then the front door opened again. "Sir." A man in a crisp black suit stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Mr. Harrington?" he asked, his voice clipped and professional. I nodded. "I'm an official process server, and I am here to serve Mrs. Mary Harrington." Without hesitation, he marched past me toward the staircase. The 3 officers instinctively took a step forward, ready to intervene if necessary. The man stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked up. "Mary Harrington?" he called out. A moment later she appeared, her face still blotchy from crying. When she nodded weakly, he held up an envelope. "Mary Harrington, you have been served." Her hands were still cuffed behind her back. One of the officers took the envelope from the process server and held it out to her. "In addition to the divorce petition," the man continued, "there is a restraining order preventing you from contacting Christopher Harrington, entering his home or his workplace." Mary's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I turned away. There was nothing left to say. The final blow. I sat across from Steve, Mary's father, in the now quiet kitchen. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. "Was it just one time?" he asked finally, his voice tired. I exhaled slowly and took another sip of bourbon before responding. "It wasn't just once, Steve." He blinked, processing that. "And it wasn't just one man," I continued. Steve's breath hitched. His fingers curled into fists on the table. I studied him for a moment, then delivered the final blow. "It wasn't even one man at a time." His face paled. His mouth opened, then closed as if searching for words. But there was nothing left to say. The weight of the truth. "I've seen the pictures and videos, Steve." My voice was steady, but the disgust was impossible to hide. "They make me want to throw up." Steve slumped in his chair, his face draining of all color. A single tear slipped down his cheek. We sat in silence for a long time, both of us lost in thoughts and memories. There was nothing else to say. Nothing that could make this hurt any less. A final encounter with Mike. I was parked outside Jackson Physical Therapy, sitting on the open tailgate of my Ford F-150. A little bird had told me that Mike had a 10:30 a.m. appointment, and sure enough, I watched as a red Ford SUV pulled into a spot a few spaces down. The driver's side door opened slowly, and Mike eased himself out of the vehicle. "Hey Mike," I called out casually. "You look like—" I paused, smirking. I let my eyes drift to the knee brace strapped to his leg, the way he winced as he put weight on it. "You know," I continued, "it might be a good idea to get yourself a handicap tag. That way you can park closer to the building, just like the other cripples." In addition to the broken nose, he still carried the aftermath of what had happened. He wasn't moving like the arrogant, untouchable man he used to be. He locked eyes with me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, to my surprise, he gave me a slight nod. Was it understanding? A silent truce? A final acknowledgement that he had lost? I wasn't sure. But without another word, he turned and stumbled toward the entrance of the building. That was the last time I ever saw him. Karma. Letting go. I had given my divorce lawyer full power of attorney to handle all legal matters. I wanted nothing to do with it. My focus was on moving on with my life. But the truth had a way of creeping back in. Tears welled in her eyes when she finally admitted it. "I was blackmailed," she whispered. Mike had threatened to put videos of Jenny on the internet. Her father had called me early in the divorce proceedings and told me the same thing. So I wasn't exactly shocked. I took a breath studying her. It might have started with blackmail, I said. But I watched the videos. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Unmasking the truth. I let out a breath, my gaze locked onto Mary's tear-streaked face. I've seen you at your most vulnerable, Mary. I've seen you thousands of times when you were lost in pleasure, when it was real. You begged for more. You begged to be taken harder. Every second that passed, if there wasn't something inside you, you were begging for it. She flinched. Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak. You remember that Labor Day weekend before college? I continued, my voice eerily calm. We made love on that raft in Simpson Lake. And afterward, we swore to each other, to be faithful, to get married after college. I let the moment hang between us. Your promise lasted 10 days. Mary's expression darkened. Are you telling me you were completely faithful your first year of college? She snapped. I didn't dignify the question with an answer. I simply shook my head because her argument, her attempt at shifting blame, was pointless. You don't get it, do you? I leaned forward, my voice quieter now but sharper. The point isn't about who did what first. The point is, whether you want to admit it or not, I don't think you ever trusted me. And right now, I have every reason to not trust you. Her breathing became shallow. Tears streamed down her face, her body visibly shrinking into the chair, as if she wanted to disappear. I kept my eyes on her as I reached for the folder that had been sitting in front of me. Without a word, I pulled out 3 photographs and laid them on the table, one by one. The first? A clear image of Mary, completely naked, legs spread wide. The second? Mary on her hands and knees. She let out a broken gasp, her whole body shuddering as her eyes flicked between the images, reality crashing down on her. And I wasn't done yet. Mary sat there, frozen, staring at the pictures in front of her as if looking away would somehow make them disappear. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her tear-streaked face a mask of devastation. But I felt nothing. No sympathy. No anger. Just emptiness. I had said everything that needed to be said. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to salvage. Slowly I stood up and gathered the folder. I'm done, Mary. Her head snapped up, panic flickering in her eyes. Chris. I raised a hand, cutting her off. You aren't worth it. The words hit her harder than anything else I had said that night. She slumped back in her chair, silent sobs racking her body. But I wasn't staying to watch her fall apart. I walked out of the house we once called home, stepping into the cool night air. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. Free. The divorce would be handled by my lawyer. The house, the assets, everything, it no longer mattered to me. As I got into my truck and started the engine, I glanced at the rearview mirror, catching one last glimpse of the life I was leaving behind. Then, without hesitation, I drove away. Not looking back. Not regretting a thing. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The end.